All right. Well, hello. My name's Katie Yasick. I'm a graduate instructor in the Fashion and Apparel Studies at the University of Delaware. Welcome to the Fashion 455 interview series. The series provides a unique learning opportunity for our students to hear from industry experts and senior policymakers on current global textile and apparel trade and sourcing issues. We also hope that the series can help our students connect classroom learning with career preparation in the exciting fashion apparel industry, particularly in trade-related areas. Today, we're delighted to have Nicole Bivens Collins join us today, Managing Principal and Practice Leader of International Trade and Government Relations with Sandler. I think I pronounced that correctly.
Yep.
Okay.
Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg.
Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg join us as a guest speaker. When learning about apparel sourcing and trade, our students often notice how much they're affected by trade policy and regulation, from tariffs and something called de minimis to UFLPA. These issues are not only critical for fashion companies, but can also be quite technical. Today, we're lucky to have Nicole with us, a true expert in trade policy and the legal aspects of trade, to help us clarify these trade rules and provide insights into um, their sourcing and trade implications. So I'll be joined with Dr. Liu today, of course, for today's interview. So thank you again for joining us, Nicole. Just to start things off, could you please give our students a brief introduction about what a tariff is and why it's a big issue for US fashion brands and retailers?
Sure. So a tariff is a tax. It is an amount that is assessed on goods that are imported into the United States. The tariffs can be range from zero tariff to 100% tariff or more. Sometimes they are assessed just on an ad valorem rate based on a percentage of the value of the shipment. For example, you may have a 10% tariff or a 15% tariff, which is added based on the value of the merchandise when it comes in. Sometimes you have a blended tariff, which might say that, for example, shoes, in some shoes, you have a certain amount, maybe 32 cents per pair of shoes, plus 3% tariff on the value. So sometimes it's a blended. Sometimes it could just be, it's going to cost you, 64 cents per pair of shoes that you bring in. It kind of varies the way it's done. The United States is a signatory to the World Customs Organization harmonized schedule, which is a massive undertaking in which all products are classified under certain numbers. And it's generally in the United States, it's a 10-digit number, but everybody has the same numbers for 6 digits. So if I make something in one country and I ship it to Canada, I know where it's going to be classified. If I ship it to Mexico, I know where it's going to be classified. And those numbers are what tell me what rate of duty I'm going to have to pay. Then once you know sort of what that duty rate is, you have to determine the source of that country of origin, because depending on where it came from, you may have to pay one duty rate or another. We have regular MFN or normal tariff rates that are applied, taxes, or we have a column 2 duty rate, which means you're a bad guy and we don't like you, and so you're going to have to pay a higher rate. And then we have a special column. It could be that it's a product that's coming in from one of our free trade partners, and so you might be able to get that in duty free, depending on where the origin is. So it's a tax. It is paid by whoever the importer is, meaning you may have heard sometimes in the news that it's the foreign countries who pay these tariffs. It is not. The only way it would be the foreigners is if a foreigner or a foreign entity is acting as the importer in the United States. And if I am, let's say that I'm from Germany and I am going to import something, maybe a BMW, and so I am going to pay that duty in the United States. But if you, Katie, were here and I was selling that to you, my BMW from Germany, then you as the importer would pay for it. So it's a tax on goods that are imported into the country, different levels, different rates, and depending on what country you're from, you may have even another different rate.
Awesome, thank you. That was a perfect explanation.
Yeah, and thank you, Nico, for giving us a very informative overview about tariff. So it sounds like tariff is a commonly used trade policy tool, definitely not new to U.S. fashion companies. But why the so-called IEPA reciprocal tariff so far this year has been so controversial? Is it because of the legal basis of imposing them, or because of its magnitude and its scope?
I think it's a combination of all the above, quite honestly, because you've got a situation where the president campaigned on wanting to have a universal tariff applied. Now, if you were to take a look, I told you that every product that comes in the United States has at least a 6-digit, if not a 10-digit number where it's classified. So in this great big book, the Harmonized Tariff Schedule of the United States, it has the different tariff rates. Some products were coming in duty free. The textile and apparel has always been one of the peak items. Footwear, textiles and apparel, and some processed foods have always been peak tariff items. So years before all these tariffs were in place, if you looked at the total monies that were being paid into the US coffers and took it as a percentage, the vast majority of that money that was coming into our coffers was tariffs paid on textiles, footwear, and apparel. So used to be that this industry really bore the brunt of the tariffs. Now what we're seeing, and as the president had campaigned on, was assessing at least a 10%, maybe a 20% universal tariff. He's now reached to find some authority, legal authority, to be able to impose those tariffs. There's various, mechanisms that one can use. The ability to control tariffs rests, according to our Constitution, with the Congress. Over the years, whether it's under the Tariff Act of 1930, the Trade Act of 1974, the Trade Act, the Trading with the Enemy Act, which is now the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, any of those different bills or laws, Congress gave authority to the president to take some action. And that's why you hear Section 201, Section 301, Section 232. All of those are sections of the law that was passed, giving the president the authority to do something. And so he's reached out and looking at all of his options, at all those different mechanisms that he has, and started using them to try to put tariffs on products. And I think, what we're seeing as of today, actually, is that the ability to use the IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, to impose tariffs is highly questioned. It's been ruled inapplicable to using tariffs by a district court, a couple of district courts, by the Court of International Trade, by the Court of Appeals of the Federal Circuit, and it's now going to the Supreme Court. At this point, about 16 judges have already said this is not legal. So now it's going to go to the Supreme Court. I'm going to be interested to see whether or not those 9 justices agree with everybody else, or if they side with the Department of Justice, with the administration, and say, nope, these tariffs can apply. So we're seeing that, I think, because these are really on shaky ground, these tariffs, the IEPA tariffs, we're seeing the administration reach out and use something that's a little bit more solid, which is Section 232, and he's doing that on an industry by industry approach. So, it's a bit of policy, it's a bit of politics, and it's an effort to try to pay for, and this is Nicole's personal opinion, I think it's an effort to try to pay for the big tax cuts that were given to corporations in the one big beautiful bill. Somebody's got to pay for that.
That's amazing. And also definitely will have huge economic implications.
Oh,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and I particularly like, it just reminds us, it's just like house of cards, right? You have a policy out there, you have a tools out there, but also it's about how to smartly use it, in a
Mm-hmm.
way that can be compliant with the existing laws and also to achieve your policy objectives. So that's
Mm-hmm.
amazing. Just help us understand the big picture and also a lot of the technical detail. So Nico, I also have a follow-up question. So when I listen to the news and not only people talking about tariff, but kind of related, they're talking about transshipment,
Mm-hmm.
especially in U.S. trade deal with countries like Vietnam. So I just wonder, like in international trade, what's the actual meaning of transshipment, and why all of a sudden this issue becomes like a controversial as well? And is it because now the current interpretation of transshipment is slightly different from the conventional understanding of these terms? So can you give us some kind of insights and information?
Sure. So sometimes I always say every industry has its terms, right? And there's certain words that you use that have very finite definitions that mean something in your industry that may not mean the same thing to the general public. And it's just because that word has been tailored to address a specific issue. For example, when you talk about an entry of goods into the United States, an entry means something very specifically. When the goods are imported in, you file an entry with customs, and that has a whole world behind it of what that word means. But sometimes when a member of Congress or someone in the administration that's not knee deep in this or neck deep in the industry, they don't understand when they use the word entry, what it means. I think we have that situation here with the word transshipment. I think that while the negotiators of these framework agreements, I think it was brought up with respect to Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and maybe Cambodia and Thailand. And they have this concept of, they raise this concept of transshipment. We then saw an executive order that the president put out saying anything that is transshipped would be assessed a 40% tariff, right? So regardless if I got my IEPA at 10%, if I'm transshipping, I'm going to pay a 40% tariff. There was an interview on Fox Business with Secretary Lutnick. And in the interview, he said, well, transshipment, it's like, if the origin is 30% Chinese, then you're going to have to pay the Chinese, that's going to be transshipped, and you're going to have to pay the high 40% tariff. I thought, well, I mean, what if I use Honduran inputs? Does that mean that I should pay a lower tariff and I shouldn't have to pay a higher tariff because they're only at 10% and China's at a higher one? Or it's a question that we don't know, because on the same day, I thought this was very interesting, CBP, Customs and Border Protection, who is very neck deep in all of the trade terminology, published something on its LinkedIn page, and then a couple of days later issued guidance on transshipment. Transshipment, as we know it, is legal. I can be, let's say I'm Mongolia, and I've made some beautiful Mongolian wool socks, and I want to get them out of the country. I'm going to have to go either through China or through Russia. I'm landlocked. I have to tranship my goods. Those goods coming in the United States are going to still say made in Mongolia. They were transshipped. Or if I'm in a remote part, let's say, of Brazil, and I've made something and I need to get it to the ports to get into a bigger boat, I'm going to put it on one boat, and a little river boat, and it's going to come down the river, and then it's going to get on another boat destined for the United States. That's transshipping, no problem. Illegal transshipping is when someone is using that conduit or that path to try to disguise the origin of the goods. So let's say I've made something in China. I don't want to pay the China tariffs because it's a 301 tariff, and I'm going to ship it through Vietnam, and somehow magically it comes out of Vietnam as a product of Vietnam. It's labeled origin made in Vietnam. Maybe the labels were changed in Vietnam. Maybe they were never changed. They were already packed as labeled made in Vietnam when they left China. But it's an intentional effort to try to circumvent tariffs or quotas or any other restrictions that might be in place. That's illegal transshipment. Now, when you read the executive order that the president put out, he says that if CBP, Customs and Border Protection, determines that a good has been transshipped, then it would be subject to the 40% tariff. So I believe we should look at CBP's definition of transshipment, despite what's been floating out there. That's where I think today. Ask me tomorrow, I could change my mind, but that's what I think today. And I think that the one thing that I would say we need to watch, and I do highly anticipate that this is, I hate to use this analogy, but I think CBP is going to shoot first and ask questions later. They're going to say, I believe it's transshipped. You have to pay the 40% tariff, and then its onus is going to be on me to try to demonstrate, no, my goods were not transshipped. They're legal. So I think it's going to be an enforcement difficulty, and you're going to be presumed to be guilty before anything else and pay that 40%.
Yeah, that's so amazing, is it? And Nicole, you also reminds me of the rules of origin. Look like there is an like these two concepts are now intertwined in the
Oh yeah,
context
Everything's
of a current
connected.
discussion. Yeah, and also leads to also, sometimes, you have the rule itself, but because of the unintentional or intentional ambiguity, the
Mhm.
enforcement itself also becomes an issue. So
Right.
yes,
again, just so amazing in the policy world. Okay, so
yep,
I know Kitty has,
Yeah.
you guys have a question, right?
Yeah, it's so interesting. We're talking about this concept of tariff engineering. I've been thinking about that a lot recently, and the concept of like legal or illegal and how it can be either really. But I was just wondering if you could explain or give some insight into how maybe fashion companies have used this tariff engineering to kind of mitigate the impact of tariffs.
absolutely. So you have a situation now where you might have one product, let's just say China, because that's easy, right? We may have one product that is subject to a 7.5%, and you may have another product that is subject to a 25% Section 301 tariff, in addition to the fentanyl tariff and the IEEPA tariff. But let's say you're trying to get out from that 25% tariff and get into the 7.5% tariff. There are certain products where if you make them a certain way, they are classified differently. So, for example, you might have a shirt that you're trying to get into the 7.5%. If you take the pockets and you put them below the waist, it's going to change the classification of that product. So I can look and I can engineer, I can look at my product, right? And I can engineer it so that now instead of paying the higher tariff in the classification for a regular men's dress shirt, I've lowered it, made it more like a, what do you call them? Guayabas, the shirt in the
I
Latin
know what you're
countries.
talking about.
Guayaba?
Where they're lower.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
pockets are down lower. When I
Yeah.
put it down lower, I've now changed the classification, and now I've put myself in the 7.5% tariff. So there's ways to do that. You can do it, there's many ways. And that's something that for years we worked with a lot of clients, one to get around, not get around, to get the lower duty, or in the days of quotas, way back in the 90s and 2000s, if a quota filled in a certain area, like the shirt's quota filled, but the jacket's quota was still open, could I modify what I'm making to get it into the jacket classification? And so we would help them to move it so they could still get the goods in. So yeah, the tariff engineering is done all around the world. It's done with shoes. One thing with shoes, for example, is people started putting a thin layer of material on the bottom, the soles of their shoes. And by doing that, it went from an outdoor shoe to an indoor shoe. And it was perfectly legal. And customs had to kind of work to shut that down. But
Yeah,
yeah,
that's so
That's
amazing,
Yeah,
right?
that's
Like a
really
new,
interesting. It sounds like from a design perspective, the design team is even needing to think about the impacts of tariffs and how they're going to impact what their consumers end up buying. But I have like a really quick question, if you don't mind. Like, isn't it also true that if like around 20% or more of the product is made with US material, that it may be able to escape some tariff regulation?
so not the MFN rate, but some of these additional tariffs, yes, there is a
Okay.
provision which says if it's US 20% or more US content, you can reduce it. Now,
Okay.
this is a big issue in the textile and apparel area. And I'll try to make it as easy as possible. There is a provision that exists right now, which
Mm-hmm.
has always said that if you use components, US components, you can deduct the value of the components from your dutiable value. So if I had this shirt and I've got I got buttons. If I had my buttons made in Georgia and I exported it, the buttons, and I put the buttons on wherever I was making it, when I bring it back in, I'm going to deduct the buttons, 10 cents from my $1.20. So now I'm going to pay on $1.10 instead of $1.20, right? That's been in the books for decades, as long as I've been practicing, 40 years at least. So the one thing in the textile and apparel industry, though, was that customs determined that a yarn is not a component and that fabric is not a component. So if I took, and we argued for a client, right, that the machinery had advanced so that you could take a yarn and put it in one end of the machine, it comes through, and suddenly I've got a seamless tank top, right, or seamless underwear, or seamless bra. I could have these things, then and they're done. I'm like, what was the component? The only component was this yarn, and this yarn came from the United States. Why can't I use that? And they're like, nope, you can't. If I make fabric Customs determines that when you cut that fabric into your pattern pieces, you have done such a substantial transformation on the fabric that now it is transformed wherever you do the cutting. So I could bring in Chinese fabric. Today, I could bring in Chinese fabric. I can cut that into my pattern pieces. I could ship the pattern, the pieces down to let's do Brazil, down to Brazil, sew my shirt, bring it back in. I can claim 100% value of the fabric because I cut the components in the United States. Makes no sense, right? But
So
if I take
interesting.
fabric that was made in North Carolina and I export that to Brazil, and in Brazil, I cut it into components and then I sew it, I bring it back in 100% Brazil. I can't use any US component. Now, that's the way it has been historically. With these new tariffs, so for my MFN tariff, that still applies. But for the new tariffs, there's this concept of 20% or more content, no longer component. So now I can start using the content. We have situations where companies are making their apparel in Central America under the FTA. They are subject to the additional IEEPA 10%. Well, they're already meeting the CAFTA. So they're already getting duty-free under that. And they're meeting the CAFTA because they're using US fabric. So now they're saying, well, I'm going to, for the IEEPA tariff, I've already taken care of my MFN rate. It's 0 because of the CAFTA. But for that IEEPA tariff, I'm going to deduct the value of the fabric that I bought in North Carolina. So now they're using that to lower the dutiable value when it comes in. So there is this whole, there's a lot of stuff going on right now, and there's ways to try to address it. What the tariff
Certainly
is,
sounds
and
like it.
well, there
Certainly
is,
sounds like there's a lot going on right now.
And
Thank you so
also
much
the
for answering all my
yeah.
questions.
And also the
sure.
devil's is in the detail. Truly, I feel like each
Oh,
term is just use it in a deliberate way. They're not just kind of like casually put in the law in these regulations. And this is also why, just as Katie mentioned at the very beginning, our students just feel, like, when we're talking about apparel sourcing and a trade is so heavily affected by trade and regulations.
and
Right.
if I can, before we go on, just one thing, Katie, really, really good point that you raised is the designers. And this is something, and it's not just in the apparel industry. I've really done this with a lot of my clients in the automotive or machinery or other industries. And I said, at this point, you must have your design team aware of what is going on, because if they design something really unique, and let's say that it requires a certain mineral that is only right now is only available in mines in China, and you approve this whole design process, you're setting yourself up to potentially have to pay all kinds of duties on it. So you need to tell them, as you're designing this, I need you to be aware, please don't source anything from China, or don't source anything from this country or that country or wherever, because they've got to be a part of this, knowing the impact of what their designs are going to do at the end of the day.
Exactly, because the designer is going to do whatever the designer wants to do because
Yep.
they're used to being the one that sets the trend and knows what the consumer wants. Well, it's not really about what exactly the consumer wants at this point. You need to
Mm-mm.
specifically engineer so many things. It's so important to have this communication between business and design.
Yep.
Thank you
Absolutely.
so much for answering all my questions on tariffs, but I did want to kind of jump to another related topic really quickly. As Gen Z consumers, a lot of my peers shop with fast fashion brands like Shein or Temu on a pretty regular basis. I've heard these two e-commerce retailers took advantage of a US trade rule called de minimis. Could you explain what de minimis is and why it was created?
Sure. So, when you go overseas and you come back into the country and the customs ask you, do you have anything to declare? And you're supposed to write down, whatever you bought, and it's $200, whatever, go in, you're fine. So that's de minimis, right? You're allowed to come in with some stuff and not have to pay any duties on it. I actually worked on this to get the law changed to increase that de minimis from $200 to $800. And the idea was that the cost of things that you buy overseas was increasing. And the law was limited to one person per day of $800 to bring something in duty free. So you could do personal shipment per day. I could order something every single day as long as it's $800 and bring it in and not have to pay any duties on it. And basically, it was data free. It was duty free and data free. I didn't have to claim the country of origin. I didn't have to, say how many kilograms and blah, 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 blah. So all that data got it changed. And then the issue is we were starting to see when this change was done that there were, and I think this is 2015, so 10 years ago, we were starting to see e-commerce take off because it wasn't that big. I mean, nobody really did a lot of e-commerce. And for like the first 6 years, the amount of trade that was coming in, that Customs was seeing coming in under de minimis was just very, very slowly increasing. People weren't really there. I mean, don't get me wrong, e-commerce was happening, but it was mainly domestic. Like they would bring in big shipments, have a big warehouse, have a pick and pack place where you place your order and it'd come out of that warehouse. It was all being done domestically. There wasn't that much coming in from offshore. When the limit was raised to 800, it started to make sense for companies to locate that pick and pack facility that was in Toledo in Mexico or in Canada. Because now, instead of importing a 20-foot container full of 2,000 pairs of jeans and paying the duty on that, I could import that 20-foot container of jeans into Canada. And because it's only going to be temporary, I'm going to export it into the United States. When I go into Canada, I don't pay duties on it. And then when I send it to you, Katie, when you've ordered this pair of jeans, I send in one pair of jeans, and now I don't have to pay duties coming in the United States. So I have just saved millions and millions of dollars by doing that. Then COVID hit. So trade was starting to catch on. Then COVID hit and everybody started ordering everything online. And it's really unbelievable. It's even like exceeding exponential increases in the amount of traffic that we saw when we were up to about 5 million packages coming in every day. It went from 5 million in a year to 5 million a day in about 4 years. In 4 years. So that's just, I don't even know if that's exponential. I don't know. That's exponential plus infinity. So they decided that they had to do something about it. Part of it is because with such traffic at such speed, you don't have insight. As I said, it's data free. You don't know what's coming in. I don't have any way to police it for intellectual property rights violations. I don't have any way to police it for any type of contraband or drugs or precursors for drugs or anything like that. So it became a big issue. The other is that our data, the integrity of the data of the United States was being degraded. And that's because before I knew that a 20-foot container loaded with 10,000 pair of blue jeans came into the port of, Norfolk, Virginia. Now I have no idea. And if I am a domestic producer of jeans and I want to say that jeans are being dumped in the United States, I have to use US data. If the US data actually shows a decline in the number of jeans that have been imported in a given year, because instead of that 20-foot container coming into the US, it was diverted to Canada or Mexico, the amount of traffic coming in, according to US data, would show a decline. How can I get the International Trade Administration or the International Trade Commission to find that I'm being damaged or seriously injured or a threat of serious injury when the data shows declines in the imports, but yet I am being hit because all this stuff is coming in over through the de minimis. So that's really what happened, how they took advantage of it. And it was created more to address the rising cost of goods overseas. And it was just sort of a confluence, I think, of events where it became a business to business proposition. I personally think that we should maintain something like that on a personal basis, and that any business to consumer trade would then be covered under a different statute, and you would have to provide data and pay any duties on it. But right now it's gone.
Wow, that's really interesting. Thank you so much for explaining. So, if de minimis was created to facilitate trade, then why has the rule become so controversial? And from recent news, the de minimis rule was officially terminated recently.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What impact could we expect now?
So we're still going to see you're still going to be able to do the e-commerce. That's not going to go away because that's become a way. It is a business business platform, right? The B to consumer, B to C, and What's going to happen now is I think we're just going to see these goods coming in, and they will revert going back to having their pick and pack warehouses here in the United States. You will order it, it'll come to you. It's not going to be, it's just, it's really, where is my warehouse and my pick and pack facility located? Is it located across the border in Mexico and Canada, or is it in Toledo or Oklahoma City? It just, that's all it really is. I don't think we're going to see that much of a difference. I think these platforms, give them 6 to 8 months, they're going to smooth out all the wrinkles. It's going to be fine.
That's great. Yeah, thank you again for sharing with us so many great insights, really, from the practice perspective, not just simply the law itself.
Yeah.
So when so because we're now talking about customs, so I know,
Mhm.
U.S. fashion companies, they also watch one regulations very closely, that is UFLPA. So, it's a very complex issue, but maybe Nicole can start with just giving us a brief overview about what is UFLPA and what it aims to achieve.
So the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, UFLPA, was really spearheaded by current Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He was one of the key campaigners and champions of this bill and getting it passed. And this was intended to address what they were seeing from a foreign policy perspective going on in China. In this one area, it's called the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. It's in the northern west part of China. It's like the size of 4 Californias. It's absolutely massive. But that population is different. They're Uyghurs. They're not Han. Most of the Chinese people are Han, like ethnicity. They're of a Han ethnicity. Their facial features, their muscular skeletal structures are different from the Uyghur. The Uyghurs are probably more, if you are familiar with the Mongolians or the Turkmenistans or some of those types of people, they look more like that. They also had, many of them were practicing Muslims, and so they actually had religion. And there were, in part of China's plan to move address the population and the need to have jobs, meaningful employment for the people, and not have everyone flocking to their big cities because they were just so big. They started a plan of, let's put some of these factories in our regions. So they undertook from the state to build facilities in different areas, and the Xinjiang region was one of them. They started doing this. There were factories. Most of the people who were the factory owners were Han descendant, and when they would go into the region, that area had a population probably 50-50 of Han and Uyghur. The Uyghur people felt they were being discriminated against, and they wanted to work, but the Han people were more comfortable with Han. And so there was an initiative then that you had to hire the Uyghur people. Well, I'm gonna pretend that this was the reason, which I know nothing other than just my opinion. I think that the Chinese state government decided, well, let's put jobs for the Uyghurs. Well, then they started saying we will do so, and what happened was there was an uprising. Basically, the Uyghur people revolted because they felt, as I said, they were being discriminated against. They weren't being given the jobs, they weren't being given the opportunities, and in an effort to try to control that population, they said, we're going to give you jobs. Well, they forced them to take jobs, and soon it became looking more like camps, keeping people in their jobs. And then as more and more people started exploring it, they started using this as a re-education, because they thought, we can't have them, striking or uprising. We can't let them, practice their religion and pray 5 times a day. So they started suppressing their religion. They started suppressing their freedoms. It became a very serious issue, and anyone buying things that were made there became a problem. And 80% of the cotton fiber was grown in the region. So the apparel industry got a good taste of this, and they started saying, if you import anything that comes from the XUAR or has a nexus with the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, that your goods would be deemed made with forced labor, and it's illegal to import goods made with forced labor. So they were stopping goods at the border, and then again, asking questions later, customs would stop them, detain them, and then say, okay, now prove to me it didn't come. You don't have a nexus with the XUAR. Tell me that that's not cotton that came out of the Xinjiang province. and
Sure.
became a huge issue.
Sure. Thank you so much, Nico. So, my research interest is sourcing and a trade. So, I'm gonna have to ask you, from your observation, what are the sourcing implications of implementing UFLPA? So you mentioned several numbers. I think it's very important. One is, as we know, China remains one of the world's leading apparel producer and exporter. And kind of, almost all China's cotton products they
Mm.
produced in the Xinjiang region. So if nothing can come from Xinjiang, and also, China is a leading exporter. So yeah, so just from your observation, how U.S. companies, their sourcing strategy, it is affected by UFLPA, or how companies are reacting to the implementation of this law.
They've shifted. They've shifted sourcing. Bangladesh, Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, India became the big beneficiaries of the need for companies to get out. The brands, the major brands, they could not risk having people protesting out front of their storefront that, oh, these cotton shirts are being made with these poor Uyghur people. So they told the suppliers, move, you got to get out of there. Don't get anything from there. Now, a lot of the cotton fiber itself is consumed in China because there's enough bodies there that they need to have it. But China is and was a very large importer of U.S. fiber, cotton fiber, and would make the yarns. And so that, as long as that wasn't being made in the region, we're still seeing a lot of U.S. cotton fiber going there, being spun into yarns, made into fabrics, those fabrics then going to Bangladesh or these other countries to be made into finished apparel goods. So it has pushed people out into different countries.
Right. And also, I think a related issue is you have to improve your documentation of your supply chain.
Oh,
We call the supply chain mapping, transparency. And then there's another issue. Katie and I, we recently looking at how companies are incorporating recycled materials into apparel.
oh,
And we
that's
know recycled cotton, where such cotton come from, especially if you do textile to textile recycling. So look like, the implementation of UFLPA will also have implications, will have impact on how companies deal with this kind of unique supply chain, even though the initial intention is to improve sustainability, but look like there's some new complexity here.
absolutely. And I would say I am aware of some major brands who canceled their recycling, producing goods made from recycled fibers or apparel because they had no way to trace back the origins of that yarn. If there were no documentation, exactly what you said, Dr. Liu, is if you did not have the documentation showing that it has no nexus with the Xinjiang region, they're like, we can't do it. We cannot afford it. And they were using these bio detectors. They use different companies. I mean, one of the major ones is Ortain that can basically get the DNA footprint of a cotton fiber. And if you look at like their 3D model, you'll see there's a green blob over here and a blue blob here and a red blob here. And the green is all Chinese, the blue is all US, and the red one over here is Brazilian. And they can tell you what cotton fiber it is. So they can test, and CBP Customs uses Ortain to test random shipments. And if someone is producing something from a recycled product and they don't have a clean test, then they would be subject to being banned. Not even paying duties, banned. The goods could not come into the US.
Yeah, thank you for great insights.
Yeah, thank you so
Yep.
much. That's really interesting, Nicole. I feel like we've learned so much today already, but before we wrap up, I just wanted to ask like a final question for students who are interested in working in trade compliance, policy, or more legal aspects of the fashion industry like yourself. Can
Mhm.
you give any insight into how our students can get started or involved, or maybe just some advice?
So I used to always say, a good teacher, a good first step is going into the US government. But right now, I'm not going to advise folks to look for government jobs because we potentially people are going to be fired if the government shuts down. And we've had a lot of people whose jobs have been terminated, and there are a lot of hiring freezes at government agencies. So my revised advice is looking at different companies specifically. There's ways to kind of understand the logistics of it and what the different rules are. And I think if you go to people, if you go to most companies right now are looking for anyone interested in the logistics, right? They want to know, can you help me in my supply chain? How could you help me make sure I'm looking at the right things, seeing the right things, knowing what's going on? There are some fantastic new software companies that are developing technologies used that companies can use to help them track their products. That's something, I mean, your all's generation, you all can look at these different softwares and programs and learn them quickly and know how they work. We're old, you know, we're like, why did you change? Why did you update my phone? Now my button over here is over there. You know, we can't adapt, so we're slow, but you all can quickly grab those things. And so, you know, maybe looking at some of the different options that are out there so that you build a skill and you go into someone and say, hey, I'm familiar with XYZ document tracking software, or I know this kind of thing, to get into sort of the logistics of it and where it's going. From the policy perspective, that one's a little more difficult in that, you know, you really would have to have experience in a government agency, experience potentially with a non-governmental organization that might be involved in trying to push policy, or you would need to work on Capitol Hill in an office with a member of Congress who may be helping to develop policy. So those are really the three avenues from a policy perspective. The avenue that I took was I went through the government. I worked at the Commerce Department for a while in the Office of Textiles and Apparel. And then I was a negotiator for the US. I did a stint over at the US Trade Representative's Office. And when we were transitioning from the GATT to the WTO back in the mid 90s, it's really dating myself, I was one of the negotiators helping to negotiate the agreements leading into that transition. So I kind of built up my experience in policy from there and then went into the private sector. So there's different routes to get to what you're doing other than, you know, just fashion and design, which is absolutely essential. And I think now one of the things I would say is, as we talked about, Katie, earlier, that the designers have to be aware of foreign policy. The designers also have to be aware of trade policy, so that every single person, not just the designer, but the person who's in logistics, the person who is the buyer has to be aware of all of these. You know, every single person now needs to follow this. I always joke that before I thought I was doing international trade, and I've become a foreign policy person and looking at geopolitics because I see, oh gosh, look, you know, this country is trying to sabotage our boats going through the Suez Canal, which is going to have an impact on what we're doing, and we may do this. And so suddenly I'm looking at all these geopolitical issues and noting that that is going to impact our trade. You know, what's going on in Nicaragua is impacting trade policy here. What's going on in India is having, with respect to where they're buying their oil, that has an impact on trade policy. So it's really become this merger of geopolitics, of not, and it's not just numbers and trade and where you're sourcing, but it's really looking at all of these aspects. And so I think someone who comes into it with a bigger mind, willing to look at all these areas, is going to be more valuable when they go and talk to different places.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for giving such a well-rounded opinion to this question. I mean, I feel like there's so many different aspects, and I feel like you really concluded that greatly, saying that even the designers need to know about the implications of trade and tariffs. Designers, merchandisers, everyone needs to be on the same page.
Every single one.
And thank you for giving such an amazing explanation and helping us walk through all of this all.
Likewise, thank you so much for joining us and just convinced me that I should continue to teach trade and resourcing to my fashion students.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nicole. It was really great getting to meet you and talk with you today.